My name is Clancy, and I'm an alcoholic. And I know some of you are rather warm this morning, fanning yourself. Once you get to be an old-timer, you just set your thermostat to cool and put on your coat. I'm glad to be here this morning. I always say when I talk that I've come, especially to the San Diego area, that I've come here at great expense and no little inconvenience. And it really is true this morning. I had breakfast with my granddaughter. I had a glass of orange juice with my granddaughter this morning in Albuquerque. I had a cup of coffee in Phoenix. And my scrambled eggs were cold by the time I got to San Diego. But it's all right. Could be worse. I might have spent the whole morning here. I don't know why people don't like me. I try to be nice. But I want to thank you for inviting me. I want to thank Barney for picking me up at the airport this morning. And it's a pleasure to be here. We've heard this morning the 12 steps of recovery, which represents the recovery aspect of Alcoholics Anonymous. We heard the 12 traditions, which cover the 12 aspects of unity, and the 12 concepts, which cover the 12 aspects of service. And so, since this is a traditions breakfast, we will discuss for a few moments the 12 traditions and what they're about. Of course, what I tell you is my opinion. I am forced to say that. I really think you're going to hear the truth for the first time. But this is my opinion. You know, a lot of times when you're new in AA, the 12 traditions and the 12 steps are like the 10 commandments. They're just something that came off a mountain somewhere and, well, this is it, Jim. And they went from there. But the 12 AA was founded without any 12 traditions. AA was founded by a group of people getting together to sustain their sobriety if they could. On June 10th, 1935, a drunken doctor got sober one more time under the help of an ex-drunken stockbroker, and from that moment on we considered to be the founding of Alcoholics Anonymous. And after that, they like most people who are engaged in a work of the heart, who are engaged in a work of the human being, ultimate higher goals, they feel that the nature of our efforts will keep us pure and good. And most people who start spiritual movements feel that. And shortly thereafter they realize, or not shortly thereafter, but after a while they realize that no matter how wonderful your goals and precepts are, you must fill your organization with human beings. And human beings are really crappy a lot of the time. It's one of the great sadnesses about staying sober a while. You keep thinking, certainly next year I'll reach that wonderfulness. I can now tell you when you reach it. You reach it on your 26th birthday. I thought sure it was going to be the 25th, but I just missed by a little. I could hardly wait till November or October to see what it's like, to see it's going to be perfect. But alcoholics, there's only one thing wrong with AA. It's made up of human beings. And alcoholic human beings to confound it. And at first they didn't, they just thought the wonderfulness of our work together will keep us pure. And the early days of AA, an awful lot of people did an awful lot of things wrong because there was no guidance except love of what we were doing, what they were doing. And the early days of AA they had all of the various types of offbeat personalities that we think are unique unto AA today. And there were promoters and weirdos and goofs and wonderful people and power-drunk individuals and all sorts of the things that make up your average AA group. And it was kind of funny except for one thing. A lot of people died as a result of it. And they had no way to stop them, except someone could say, I don't think you ought to do this. And they'd write back to, well, I think I should. Screw you. And there were a guy in Florida who was selling memberships in AA. There were guys fighting for control. And after a great many people died, the steps came from somewhere else. But the 12 traditions, every one of these traditions are based. A lot of people died to bring about each tradition. This really is a survival technique. And it's important because today, as has always been the case, I have been sober since 1958, and before that I was slipped around AA for 9 years, so I've been here since the 1940s in Alcoholics Anonymous, in one form or another. For 9 years I didn't quite track, but I have a few glimmerings. In fact, that's one of the funny things about AA. People come to AA now, old-timers will say things like, you should have been around in the old days. We were sincere. We wanted the program. You should have come in the 60s, by God. We really, When I came to my first AA meeting in 1949, they were telling me that I'd gotten there too late then. I should have been around in 1942. That's when they really were sincere. But you will find, I think, that that type of sincerity does not indicate a change in Alcoholics Anonymous. It indicates a change in the personality of the individual. I never really understood that until, when I was about a year and a half sober, a little over a year and a half sober. I went to my first international convention. I wouldn't have gone, but it was in Long Beach. And so I went. It seemed like an inconvenience, but I went down there. For those of you who don't know, international conventions are held in AA every 5 years. And I went down there, and I was really touched by it. In fact, I wanted so much to hear Bill Wilson tell his story. And there was a big mob outside that I volunteered to be an usher. And I got an usher's badge, and I went to the front, found an old lady, helped her down to the front row, sat next to her, took off my usher's badge, and I wouldn't do that now. I would, now that I'm an old-timer, I'd sit in the back and see who was listening. But that was really touching, and it was large. It was too large for any edifice in Long Beach, so they held it in the Long Beach College football stadium. And they had a long program, and finally then Bill Wilson got up. It was like going to Gettysburg and hearing Lincoln give the Gettysburg Address. I mean, really, he talked about living history. The things you read about in these books, he was talking about having happened to him. And it really was just living history. And as the night progressed, it got colder. And there were a bunch of people there. Looked like they'd been sober a long time. Fat cats, I thought they were. And they were going, cold. And for about an hour and a quarter of his talk, he gave a long talk. And he'd, not as long as I'm going to give this morning, but it wasn't long. But he gave a long talk. And some of these people were getting up and leaving. And I just got enraged. I wanted to holler at him. You rotten thinks! You wouldn't even be alive if that man up there hadn't done the things he's talking about. And now you're a little cold and it's inconvenient for you. And I didn't, but I wanted to shout, you can talk till morning, Bill, and I'll be in this seat. I don't know who else will be, but I'll be here, goddammit. I thought about that for days afterwards. What kind of people are those? In 1965, I was doing a little better. I was working for a television station in Hollywood, and I went to the International Convention, which was held that year in Toronto, at the Toronto Maple Leafs Garden, it's called. And 15,000 people packed in there. And Friday night, long program, and Bill Wilson got up and gave his talk. I thought, isn't this wonderful? But he gave a long talk. And after about an hour, I found myself looking at my watch thinking, Jesus Christ, I said I'd meet him in the hotel at 11. This is going to go on forever, for Christ's sake. After all these years, you'd think he'd learn to confine it to an hour. And on the way home from there, I got thinking, what's changed in AA? And since then, I don't really... I try to watch that myself. I think I've been able to maintain some degree of enthusiasm in Alcoholics Anonymous when I can remember when it gets gray, it is usually me. My enthusiasm is flagging, or I'm carried away with my more important things. And that's why they talk about the old days. The old days in AA were not terribly more sincere than they are now, I'll tell you. There were people who were very sincere in working at it, and there were people who were borderline cases, and there were just sharpshooters who were nothing. And I would say the ratio of people staying sober in the early days of AA were lower than it is now, perhaps. They talk about this book. They talk the first 100, based on the experiences of the first 100 men and women who stayed sober. Now, in the first place, there weren't 100 men and women who had stayed sober a year. Bill Wilson later modestly admitted he had rounded it out. It was 79. But 100 sounds a little better than 79. And he was a promoter, you know. They often say if it hadn't been for Bill Wilson, AA would never have gotten out of Akron. Because Dr. Bob was very conservative and he sat in the same chair in the same meeting in the King Street School till he died. On the other hand, if it hadn't been for Dr. Bob, this would have turned into Synanon. They provided an exquisite balance. We might have all had to shave our heads one day just for drill to see if we were sincere. But of those first 79, most of them died drunk, because that's the nature of the illness they had. And people didn't know how to go, and there was no ultimate power other than the individual conscience. And the individual conscience, as you know and I know, varies a great deal depending on circumstance. And from day to day, sometimes it all looks different. And when I get tired and cross, my conscience is different than when I'm feeling good. When I'm tired and cross, they deserve to be punished. But I'm feeling good, I'm magnanimous. And so they had, after a few years, the grizzled survivors of those early days, that there should be something we can do that will pass on what we have learned here, what the survivors have learned. And in the late 1940s, they got together, a group of these guys, and they tried to evolve and to distill what they had seen be most lethal to the membership. And by 1949, they had come up with these 12 traditions. Not in the form you heard them read this morning. They were in what is known as the long form of the traditions. I don't know if you're familiar, some of you may not be familiar with the long form. But in this book, it's on the page against the short form. We hear the short forms at meetings, but the long form adds a third dimension to it. At our meeting in Los Angeles, we may be one of the very few meetings in the world to do it, but we read the long form once a month so that everyone will understand what's in it. And that's something you might think about in your group. People groan and moan, but it doesn't really take much longer than chapter 5, and it really makes them understandable. Because you hear them read so many times, the short form, you can hear them read night after night, and after a while you just trip out on them. You just... And you can recite them, but you don't know what the hell they're talking about. The only guy from membership is Irish Tom Ring. But that short form is pretty good. But they came up with the long form. And then they distilled them down for public use into the short form, because a lot of people didn't want anything that might make them think, I guess. And in 1950, at the first International Convention of Alcoholics Anonymous, they introduced them. I had the tapes of guys making talks on each tradition, explaining why they think this tradition should be accepted. It really is great listening. That first convention was an excellent indication of why the need for traditions. I'll tell you why. They almost didn't have it. Why? Because of conflicts between the New York AA and the Akron AA. Dr. Bob's followers said, we're going to have it in Akron. Bill Wilson's followers said, we'll have it in New York. And so they just, screw you. Akron or I don't go. Well, New York or I don't go. Made up of human beings and alcoholics without guidance. Not guidance, they had guidance, but without an overriding appeal area. In fact, they had to have a kind of a Bill and Dr. Bob. They didn't get involved in it, just their followers. They kind of remained above it, but made up of human beings. And they finally got together and said, well, we'll go to Cleveland and have it. And that's where they held it, as a compromise in Cleveland. And they, in 1950, they introduced these things. They had law. It was like a national political convention where they introduced the platform. They read them and described them and discussed each tradition at length and why they thought it should be there. And they were accepted by voice acclamation. There were a few people who voted against them. They felt, we are not here to be told what to do. We come here to find spiritual freedom. The same shit you hear today. And that is fine as long as you are made up of perfect people, but there aren't any perfect people. There are some who I thought were perfect till I got to know them personally, and then nobody's perfect. Nobody's perfect at all. In fact, what makes AA such a remarkable place is that so many imperfect people do so well. That's what makes it wonderful. If the old timers were perfect, you and I would be screwed. You know, I remember when I was new, when I was new this time, I was sullenly sitting in the back of the Beverly Hills meeting where I'd gone to see if I could find a sponsor who would like to underwrite my recovery. And so this speaker, he just made me sick. He says things like, I no longer have anger. He was 7 years sober. He was just out of sight, you know. I no longer have rage. I have come to love my fellows in all areas of my life. And it seemed to me I'd heard that 1,000 times. Oh, Jesus. I can never be like that. Maybe I'm just too emotional to ever stay sober. And I went after the meeting. I don't know what devil made me do it, but I pretended to stumble. and I laid a hot cup of coffee down in front of this man's suit. And I was just pleased as punch. He regained anger, rage. And he told me that I was a clumsy son of a bitch. And he doesn't know it to this day, but he spiritually helped me. I came to understand sometimes people just tell the good parts on the podium. They don't talk about their weaknesses and fallibility. That's one of the sad things sometimes. In meetings, and we're all human, we have a tendency to do it. Sometimes we're so eager to convey to the new people how good it's become that we forget to tell them that it isn't always good. And when they have bad days, they think they are the only ones who are having them. So they think AA doesn't work. AA does not make you wonderful. AA makes you better. That's why it doesn't say the road to happy destiny. There's no place you ever get. The road of happy destiny. Because you keep trudging it, and some days it's all uphill. Some days any alcoholic who's been sober longer than 20 minutes knows that there are some days that by 11 o'clock in the morning, you know that they've all just gone crazy today. First, I don't know how they all knew to contact each other, but they did. Old ladies on the freeway. See the boy in the blue LTD? He's tired. I'm going to cut that son of a bitch off. It just makes you crazy. There are some days in every life where all you say is, come on, midnight. And other days, you just know everything is wonderful. God's in his heaven, all right with the world. I was thinking about that on Friday. I got up and I felt so good, and I got to work. And a guy had just died in his bed upstairs where I work. And another guy had been stabbed, and the FBI was there to pick a murderer out of the food line. And somebody said, that's the way it gets when it's Friday the 13th with a full moon. And Jesus, I thought it was a good day up till then. After that, I don't believe in that stuff, but why take chances? But anyway, they introduced these traditions. Now, the interesting thing about the traditions is this. You will note there is no enforcement. The traditions are, in a sense, as if the law were to say, thou shalt not kill. But if you do, you really shouldn't. And try not to do it again. AA has no police force. I think it's dreadful sometimes. I've said this many times. In my area, I am known as a dictator-type sponsor because a strong personality was able to save my life by superimposing actions over my rationalizations. So I get usually the dregs of AA. You better go to Los Angeles and see that goddamn Clancy. You're too sick for us. I get the slippers and the pukes and it. If I could get new people like you, I'd. But in my area, I have a reputation as a dictatorial type sponsor. I get a lot of heat for it. And what people never realize, it is impossible to be a dictator type sponsor without the complete agreement of this baby. Because you have no enforcement. All the baby ever has to do is say, screw you, Jack, and the dictatorship is over. That's the end of that. I've often thought, wouldn't it be nice if sponsors had just a little authority figures who would come in the night and say, did you say screw you to your sponsor? We understand you still have relatives living in Akron. Seems reasonable to me. But AA's traditions have no enforcement other than the General Service Office, when a severe error is called to their attention, they will send them a letter and ask them not to do it anymore. The only other known enforcement is in a central office. If your group is not being operated by some degree of AA traditions, they will not list you in the meeting list. But that is the only punishment there is in AA. There is no punishment. Now, there is a punishment as a rule, but it cannot be enforced at any given time. And that is this: when people get far enough out, we have one enforcer. His name is John Barleycorn. And he comes along and strikes people drunk from time to time. But you can't always wait for that. But you have to. But these 12 traditions, then, are guides to the operation of the group. Now today, and in many other areas of time, but today even more intensely, AA is subject to pulling forces. AA is subject to people who want to change its structure. AA is subject to a great deal of unrest. And the odd thing about Alcoholics Anonymous is this: AA has nothing to fear from outside of its membership. Outside of its membership, we are impervious. The danger comes from within our membership, of people who think they are the first ones who have that idea, that this shouldn't be this way, it should be done this way. Wouldn't it be much more efficient if we did that and did this? And that is why it is important for us to once in a while contemplate these traditions, because everything that's been thought of has been tried and has killed people. And that's why we want to remember it once in a while. This morning, the temptation was for me to go through the 12 traditions and read them and tell you about them, but you can do that. I want to talk about 3 areas of the traditions: the 3rd tradition, and the 7th tradition, and the 11th and 12th tradition, because they are the most controversial today. The 3rd tradition says in its short form, the only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking. In the long form, not too much different, it says, our membership ought to include all who suffer from alcoholism. Hence we may refuse none who wish to recover, nor ought AA membership ever depend upon money or conformity. Any 2 or 3 alcoholics gathered together for sobriety may call themselves an AA group, provided that, as a group, they have no other affiliation. As a group, they have no other affiliation. Now, there's a few things in there. You know, in the late 1930s, I think Bill talks about it in 12 and 12, one of the first problems they had about that, they were looking at that time for pure alcoholics. People who had no emotional upsets, but just pure alcoholic problems. Well, they gave that up, I'll tell you. In fact, since the first publishing of it, there has only been one word changed in the book Alcoholics Anonymous, and that was in the traditions. That was in the steps. 3rd step. And it talked about, the 3rd step says, having a desire to stop drinking. Or 3rd tradition, I'm sorry. The 3rd tradition is, the only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking. In the original form of the traditions, accepted in Cleveland in 1950, it said, the only requirement for membership is an honest desire to stop drinking. That sounded better to old-timers. Then later they began to realize they had never known anybody with an honest desire to stop drinking. And by the time the traditions were next published, they had deleted the word honest. That's a true story, because, an honest desire is what you get after you've been here a while. Like they always say, all we ask of newcomers is honesty, open-mindedness, and willingness. Christ, if you had that, you wouldn't be coming here. The requirements for membership here more likely are dishonesty, closed-mindedness, and unwillingness, and a refusal to contemplate it. You only hear old-timers say things like, and then I went into my first meeting, and I knew I was home. I've been taking newcomers to meetings for 25 years, and I've been just waiting for one, just one, to say, hey, I'm home. You know you're in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous when you talk with the entire front table. Say, do you have an ashtray? An ashtray? And they'll go, huh? But I don't judge. They finally had a lot of problems, and then they finally had to come to the agreement that they gradually evolved it. If you are an alcoholic, whatever else you have, that's the foundation of that tradition. The long form says the only requirement for membership is that we cannot deny membership to anyone. And any 2 or 3 people can call themselves in any group as long as they have only alcoholism in common. And that is one of the reasons that some traditionalists, and I understand this, and I do too, view with some degree of, not absolute appreciation, of special groups getting together. All airline pilots, all doctors, all lawyers. And there's nothing really wrong with these groups in the sense, as long as they are introductory groups to Alcoholics Anonymous, and they help people identify. But they must move out into the world. They must get into AA, because the whole function of Alcoholics Anonymous is that it is a microcosm of society. And invitation-only meetings. I remember I used to look at them with envy and wish I could be invited. By the time I got to a position of being invited, I didn't want to be there, because my values had changed. There used to be a movie star in Los Angeles who had a movie meeting in his garage and had it for 5-6 years. And I worked my fingers to the bone to get an invitation to that goddamn thing. And it took me 2 years, and I finally got there. God, it was remarkable. A garage full of stars. Why, I saw you and I saw you and you were... And they went around the room and talked. They'd all been members of this group for years. I'd only been there 2 years. I thought it was a newcomer. They went around the room, and I had the longest sobriety in the room. I never wanted to go back. They all understood each other's slips because of the nature of their special problem. And it's the same thing in most individuals. I spoke to the international doctors in Alcoholics Anonymous a couple of months ago, and I told them that same thing. I said, if the only successful ones here are the ones who just come here once in a while. And they didn't like to hear that. But that's true. I know a lot of them. It's okay to go there, but you better be going to AA, because that is an AA. AA is not allied with any sect, denomination, politics, religion, age, nothing. You can call yourself whatever you want, and any group can call yourself what you want. But Alcoholics Anonymous is society, as it is. Some colors and religions and sizes and ages, and that's where we learn to live together. And you can't keep anybody out if they're an alcoholic. But now the big problem is coming in the crunch. This tradition comes under a lot of heat because they say, today AA, the major problem is narcotics. My God, we should allow people with heroin habits who are dying as well as people with alcoholic habits who are dying. And there doesn't seem to be much of an answer to that, except the acrid one. You could start off with history if you want. In 1840, the only other successful movement in the treatment of alcoholism came about. That was called the Washingtonian movement. And they worked with alcoholics, and they recovered hundreds of thousands of alcoholics. Abraham Lincoln was one of their lecturers. Attended some of their meetings. Not that as an alcoholic, but as one who wished well for them. And they had done so well with alcoholics dealing with each other that they wanted to help other people. And they helped people with laudanum problems, which was an early goofball stuff. They helped people with opium problems. They began helping people with sexual problems. They began helping people with marriage problems. And by late 1860s, they were extinct. And they couldn't imagine why. We had such a good thing working. Why didn't it work for these people? And it gets back to a precept that you will understand, I'm sure, but it's something good to remember. The only thing that differentiates Alcoholics Anonymous from any one of thousands of movements that have tried to help alcoholics is that it is composed of one alcoholic talking to another alcoholic. If good advice would have done it, I would have got that good advice from my minister when I was 19 when he visited me in jail. If good advice would have done it, I would have got it from my psychiatrist, to whom I spent thousands of dollars. And he maybe probably gave me better advice than my sponsor gave me. But I always knew, you don't understand. That is the concept that makes AA successful. One alcoholic talking to another. That's why it's so ridiculous. Sometimes groups, they don't do it much anymore, but they used to do it 20 years ago. To show how well they were doing, they'd have the local minister come and address their AA group, or a doctor, or a psychiatrist, or some businessman, as if to give some sort of imprimatur that they're doing well. None of them are worth anything. Nothing to do with them. Because the hallmark, the things that makes this necessary and possible, is one alcoholic talking to another. And when you follow that, extrapolate that to the end, it is not one alcoholic talking to a gambler. It is not one alcoholic talking to a compulsive eater, even though the problems are similar. It is not one alcoholic talking to an addict. It's one alcoholic talking to another. An addict may be more interesting to listen to sometimes, but it is not what gets us well. Now, that is why when they say closed meetings, they mean alcoholics only. And that's why in most groups, unless you are an alcoholic, you will not stand at the podium. Not because you're putting anybody else down, but because that's what the recovery is based on. Now, you can be an alcoholic and an addict. You can be an alcoholic and anything, and a pillhead, and anything. But unless the word is, I am an alcoholic, you have no business participating in Alcoholics Anonymous. Really. And it's not to put anybody down. That's why 25 years ago they founded Narcotics Anonymous. Members of AA founded that so that narcotics would have a place to go, narcotic addicts. That's why a member of AA founded Gamblers Anonymous. You all know Sybil. Her husband founded Gamblers Anonymous. He's the Bill Wilson of Gamblers Anonymous. He died last year, and they had big international sorrow about his death. To us, he was just a poor AA. There he was something, because he saved a lot of lives. That's why a member of AA and another woman started Overeaters Anonymous. I was their second speaker, I guess, in 1960, because they couldn't get any speakers. and they didn't have any success. They had a bunch of AAs come up with them. I was a wonderful speaker for them. I didn't have any front teeth. But I'd learned to carry my lip like this. And I gave them hell, boy. I said things like, "We've watched you grow." I'm not defending that. I thought I was cute. But that's why the third tradition is so important. The only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking. It's kind of hard to admit you're an alcoholic if you're not an alcoholic. And that's why we have to sometimes be careful of that. Because every temptation is, I know a lot of people, I've worked with them. 20 years ago I was sponsoring narcotics addicts, and I had the other side of this coin. But I began to understand why. It's a different thing. The recovery may be the same, but the identification is different. And very few of us are helped by hearing someone at the podium for an hour talking about pills and heroin. It doesn't identify. You don't identify with it. And that's the only thing that makes it possible to survive is identification. Without that, if it's just information, Christ, we can get that from doctors, counselors, lawyers. Now, that's a good thing to remember. And it's not because you're putting anybody down. It is because that is the thing that makes AA work when nothing else works. And the absence of that factor is what's killed the Washingtonian movement. The next one I want to talk about briefly is the seventh tradition, which is not very difficult. Let me read the seventh tradition for you, long form. The AA groups themselves ought to be fully supported by the voluntary contributions of their own members. We think that each group should soon achieve this ideal, that any public solicitation of funds using the name of Alcoholics Anonymous is highly dangerous, whether by groups, clubs, hospitals, or other outside agencies. That acceptance of large gifts from any source or of contributions carrying any obligation whatsoever is unwise. Then, too, we view with much concern those AA treasuries which continue, beyond prudent reserves, to accumulate funds for no stated AA purpose. Experience has often warned us that nothing can so surely destroy our spiritual heritage as futile disputes over property, money, and authority. That has a couple little things in there to think about. For example, now we all understand our little group that rents your group or mine that rents a basement of a church, and we put money in the basket and we pay the rent and buy the coffee. But there's a new element going on now in Alcoholics Anonymous. And it's getting to be a little bit of it doesn't seem to be a problem, it seems to be a kindness, but it's a problem. And that is various facilities who are inviting Alcoholics Anonymous to hold meetings within there and giving them free rooms and free rent and free coffee and free everything. Now, no matter how you slice it, there are no free lunches. You are lending the AA name to their recovery program in exchange for your rent. And that is not even truly an AA meeting. It's more like a panel in a sense, because there's very little participation by the people involved who are there for the help. So I think that you have to be very careful. You don't take nothing for nothing, because there's nothing for nothing. You're going to pay for it one way or another. That is why some of these places can say AA-oriented and AA treatment hospital and so on. There are no AA hospitals. AA is not a physical location. AA is lucky to rent a central office. That's the only thing they got. There's no other physical location. And these hospitals, one by one, some of them really hate AA, have hated AA. For example, for years there's a big chain of hospitals named after a man who smokes pipe tobacco, created pipe tobacco. Forget his name now. He's up in the hills there somewhere. They wouldn't allow AA into their hospital, but they've had so much failure, now they've allowed AA in, but they tell them what to say. And they say, we are AA-oriented. And it's just dreadful. It's just dreadful. I have a couple of people who sponsor on one of those panels, and I said, stay out of there. Nothing wrong with the hospital, nothing wrong with the people in there. But it's not Alcoholics Anonymous. It may be, if you want to do it as a kindly citizen, that's fine. But it's not AA. AA is a way of doing things. And that's one of the reasons that, I'll tell you something kind of odd. There's a woman in New Jersey named Geraldine D. or Delaney. And she was one of the first people to ever have an alcoholic hospital. One of the biggest in the world. And she runs it. She's a good AA. She still goes to meetings 3 nights every week, and she's active in 12-step work in addition to the hospital. That's why her hospital is so efficient. And over the years, she has been asked to provide counselors all over the country because she has excellent counselors and people who might become counselors. And she's very familiar with the field of counseling. She told me something in Ohio about 5 years ago that staggered me. She said it's hard to realize. She's been about 80, as far as I can tell, nationally, about 80% of the AAs who become counselors eventually get drunk. Why? Technically, there's intellectually no reason for that. Jesus, you're going to put your experience to work helping others. But it is made up, we are made up of human beings. And what happens to them, I can see it. I can see it very clearly. I can see it in me. You become such an authority during the day on the nature of alcoholism that there's no reason sitting in those rooms with the amateurs at night anymore. And they little by little drift away. Now, this isn't true of all. Some guys become excellent counselors and stay good AAs, but you will notice more often than not, if you see a friend who's become an alcoholic counselor, he or she will, over a period of time, begin to change. They will be less involved. They will be less enthusiastic. They will be less around. And they know more than you do, and they don't even want to talk about it. And that's part of the problem here. But the nature of the illness lurks within us. AA is a way of doing things. It isn't how much you know. And that's why we have to be careful we do them right. Every AA group should be self-supporting through its own contributions. We must not allow the name to be used in exchange for rent, wherever it may be. And the other thing, of course, is that the increase of AA treasuries. Anybody who's been sober very long has sooner or later seen a treasury where they're saving money for something. Usually it's for the treasurer to get drunk and split. That's usually where it winds up. There must be literally thousands of cases where treasurers can't pay their rent and they've got $800 in the bank. They think, I'll just borrow it this once. Because that's human behavior. And so it's a good thing. That is the only reason. You get fighting over the use of the money. What do we do with the money? And how come you're in charge of the money and I'm not in charge? On and on. That's why we give contributions. Keep a month's rent. Keep a little extra. But I'll tell you, getting rid of that money looks like it's financially insecure, but it isn't. It is going to save somebody's life along the way. The other tradition I want to talk on briefly this morning is the 11th and 12th, because those are under a lot of heat now. We'll be out of here at 12 o'clock, don't worry. Mainly because I got to catch a plane. I'm going to read the 11th tradition, the long form. No, our relations with the general public should be characterized by personal anonymity. We think AA ought to avoid sensational advertising. Our names and pictures as AA members ought not to be broadcast, filmed, or publicly printed. Our public relations should be guided by the principle of attraction rather than promotion. There is never need to praise ourselves. We feel it better to let our friends recommend us. And then the 12th tradition carries that through. And finally, we of Alcoholics Anonymous believe that the principle of anonymity has an immense spiritual significance. It reminds us that we are to place principles before personalities, that we are actually to practice a genuine humility. This to the end that our great blessings may never spoil us, that we shall forever live in thankful contemplation of Him who presides over us all. Probably over the years, no single tradition has got more heat than that one. Because it just, I spent most of my adult life in advertising and public relations, and I understand the principle of it. Jesus, think how much good it would do for AA if we get this movie star to publicly say that she's an AA. If we get this athlete to say he's publicly an AA. That's called testimonial advertising. We'll get people beating down the doors here, people who are afraid to come. Why not do that? Some people have overruled AA. There was a book maybe 20 years ago, maybe a little longer than that, called I'll Cry Tomorrow. And the author said, AA means well with this little tradition, but I want people to know that I came to Alcoholics Anonymous. It'll help AA. And it came out, and I guess the membership built a little bit in her group. But when she was laying face down drunk in the streets a couple months later, I guess they also knew that was an AA too. But a lot of people think the reason not to do this is to protect AA. That's what the 11th tradition sounds like. We want to protect AA. And I guess it's true to an extent. It was written in days when they wanted to protect AA against what people could do to it. But as the years went by, Bill Wilson wrote a series of letters. In fact, the last letter Bill Wilson wrote before he died was a reiteration of this reason for anonymity. And the great reason for the reiteration of anonymity is not to protect AA, but to protect the individual who is breaking his anonymity. Because if I break my anonymity in order to help you, AA is no longer a place where I'm going for help. That's a place where I've helped you. And I rise above you little people. I had very difficult with them. The last couple of weeks, I've been being interviewed for an article that's supposed to appear in the Reader's Digest in December on the work I do on Skid Row in Los Angeles. And they went into my background. And you're in the nut house and all these jails, and you lost everything. And then you became successful. What happened? Well, I don't know. I guess they just felt different. It's really a hard thing to describe. Fortunately, the writer was understanding, and he knew what was going on, so between us we worked it out. But it's a very hard thing to explain why you shouldn't be why you should, be so nice to say, Jesus, the Reader's Digest. Hey, I'm an AA and I'm doing well. Instead of all these goofs who say they are an AA and break their traditions, why not have somebody who's successful and say, and AA would survive whatever I said. But I wouldn't ever want to be in a position of thinking I was going to help AA. AA is where I get my help. And one of the ways you get help here is by following the traditions, whether I see the reasons or not, in which hundreds and sometimes thousands of people gave their lives to prove the validity of those traditions. These things seem kind of dull sometimes. As I said a little while ago, you sit in the meetings and you hear them read. You usually have a newcomer read them, and the only question is, will he pronounce autonomous right? Or will he say anonymity? Or no? No. But I think once in a while, I'd make a suggestion to you. That maybe you stop a little bit and think about those 12 traditions, and if you are sponsoring people, you might explain something to them about it. It might be a good idea to suggest that in your home group you read the long form of the 12 traditions once a month or something, because they really go into a little more depth. They're not just a glib phrase. It talks about why we are doing it. But most important, whether you see why we are doing it or not, you got to do it. Because if you don't, you are putting yourself in the twilight zone. I'll tell you. I have never known anyone who has significantly violated the traditions who's ever profited from it. I'll tell you, in any way. And I've known a lot of them. I have used to do public relations work for the central office. I used to write the letters sometimes, explaining why you shouldn't say it. You know, some of these people, the fourth time they say, "Oh, I guess he must." Some of these actors and actresses, they get. I'll tell you, one of the tragic cases, although it turned out well. Some years ago, you may remember, in Washington, very famous congressman, chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, got in some jams in the pool with some. I guess he had seen From Here to Eternity and couldn't find a beach and just went down to the pool. But they sent him to a hospital in Florida. And the next thing, he was announced. Announcements were made. Wilbur M. in Alcoholics Anonymous. Then they start giving his last name. And then they start who he was. And people were appalled. And the problem was, he didn't know any better. The son of a bitch running the hospital was using him to recruit members for the hospital. I guess, I heard. Well, anyway, he finally got back to Washington, and he fell into the hands of real AA members. And his anonymity was never mentioned again. And he felt so bad what he had done. Now, I'll tell you something. One of the reasons he's successful, I guess, I don't know if it's just because he felt it bad, but he wanted so much to be a member of AA that he went to a meeting every day for 8 years and never once allowed his name to be mentioned again. Now, and he's still very, very active. And you may see him from time to time speaking at conventions, but never by his last name. See, here's the thing about the anonymity. People sometimes don't understand. For instance, in this article in the Reader's Digest, I have perfect right to say I'm a recovered alcoholic and give my last name. But I cannot mention that I'm a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. Or, I can say I'm a member of Alcoholics Anonymous and my name is Clancy I. What you can't say is use your name and your membership in AA for your self-aggrandizement. Because that's what that goes back to that guy telling people, selling memberships in AA and using AA and say, I'm an AA member, give me a list of AAs, I want to sell them some stock. And on and on and on like that. And there's on the fringes of organization, there's always weirdos. People who like to get obscene phone callers, for Christ's sake, and weirdos and ginks, like there is all over society. Now, anonymity does not mean within the group. It says at the level of press, radio, and films. Some parts of the country, it really makes you want to puke. My name is Jim. Oh? Yeah, thanks. Give me a call sometime. Within the group, there is nobody here. Within the group, we don't have to be with other sober members of AA. You shouldn't have to not give your name, although, it's not always necessary for young ladies to give young men their phone numbers for help, or vice versa. But you can use your name to stand at the podium. You shouldn't use your last name at the podium. In a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, no, why not, for Christ's sake? I'm proud to be a member of AA. I'm afraid some member of AA is going to find out who I am. Then you should go to a special interest meeting where other celebrities like you can sit and gaze into each other's eyes and explain why you slipped this week. As alcoholics, it isn't easy to stay sober anyway sometimes. And the traditions merely give you a little help on that, a little cushion. But the reason we do these things, the reason that it's good to remember these things, that it's not just an exercise given to a newcomer to read at the meeting. That these literally are the results of thousands of lives like yours and mine who did it differently without knowing why. That's why the only authority we have is the group conscience. Not some old fool sitting in the back who still keeps control after year, but you have elections and people have a chance to get together and talk about things. That we are a vital, living organization. That there is nothing to be ashamed about. But that we must live within certain parameters, because no matter how wonderful we think we become, we are human beings. And human beings are fallible and mistake-prone and selfish and petty sometimes, in addition to being good and generous and kind. And we must gather together to remember these things and know why we're doing them. And if you don't know why, do it anyway. That's the principle of AA. Nobody wants you to know why. Just do it, goddammit. And you last longer. This to the end that our great blessings will never spoil us, that we shall forever live in thankful contemplation of Him who presides over us all. Thank you.